Matt Larkin writes children adventure stories with heart, and they're the sort of books I particularly love. He started his writing career with Zack Powell, writing Zack Powell books, and we're going to talk about that. His debut book went off like, I'm going to use my favourite expression, like a frog in a sock. It was very, very popular, and it was called Orchard Underground. He lives in Melbourne or Naarm on Wurundjeri land, and it is fabulous to talk to him. Matt Larkin, hello.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Sue.
So, Matt, you started your writing career writing for Zack Power. How did that happen?
Through a combination of work, luck, and privilege is what I normally say because, and most people are horrified by this story. I was asked to pitch for Zack Power after meeting Marisa Pintado, now the publisher of Hardy Grant Egmont, at a party. She says to me that we met, we chatted, and afterwards she said, "Oh, that guy seems interesting." And I had some blog posts and columns and things that I'd written online. She went and read them. She thought, "Oh, he seems to be able to write too." So she got in touch with me and said, "We've got this children's series. Would you like to pitch something for it?" And so I was actually asked to do my first thing instead of joining the queue like everybody else does. And so I don't say it's undeserving because I did work really hard on it when I got it, but it is a really fortunate thing that I just happened to meet somebody. I don't remember the party, by the way, and I don't remember saying anything entertaining. It doesn't sound like me, but whatever it was, it just got me a chance. And once I got the chance, I had a lot of learning to do. I'd never written for young children before. And so I had to do a lot of research, I did a lot of reading essentially. And Zack, which is was a series for sort of 10-year-old kids, very much a kind of getting kids into reading who aren't into reading. So there was an explosion or a gadget or something on every second page, a monster or some thrilling cliffhanger. And so I had to learn the formula. There's a Bible for it. And I think that what Marisa was doing was auditioning writers, essentially apprenticing writers, new writers through that series. Finding out, could you work to budget, to schedule, could you be edited professionally, those kinds of things. And that was where I put the work in, essentially, was to justify my place there and show that I could do the job, which wasn't easy. Going through a process like that for the first time is actually quite hard. But you just kind of wriggle your way through and hopefully get there.
Yeah, exactly. And, you say it was lucky. You'd actually done the work in other ways, though. You'd blogged, you'd written other things. So it wasn't like you were brand new to writing. What had you
I
done?
wasn't, no.
What were you blogging about and what were you writing about before, Zack?
So in around 2005, I had a desultory career in university administration that I hated. And so I started writing blog posts to keep myself interested. I was writing an adult novel, which was mediocre at best, and it never really got anywhere. But it was just me feeling out whether I felt I could do it and was committed to it enough to actually try it as a career. And in 2005, I quit my job and met with a journalist friend and just said, "I want to be a writer. How do I do it?" And she read some things that I'd written and said, "Well, maybe you've got potential, I'm not sure." And they gave me a job through an agency writing cricket columns for crikey.com.au, which it was the only sport that I could name three people in, and I could only name three people in it. And I got street press rates to write something like 200 bylines for them over a couple of years. Just for their email that they went out every morning, which taught me a lot, how to get something out quickly, how to write to a tone, that kind of stuff. And then from there, I just sort of built up jobs through word of mouth, and I was doing lots for the universities that I'd left working, doing little content jobs here and there, and very much just learning on the job as I went. And it took me two goes. Twice I had to give up and go back to university administration because I just wasn't making any money out of it and couldn't get anywhere. And picked up a job in mental health writing, which I've done consistently since. It's something I'm really passionate about. But really, it was just sort of picking up bits and pieces. And then because that wasn't the work I wanted to do, I thought, well, I'd better start putting samples of the work I want to do out into the world. So I started just writing funny blog posts, just whatever I could think of, 750 words on a theme. But I worked really hard to polish them and make them into something that was more than just whatever I'm thinking right now. I tried to give them some structure and, edited them and was hard with myself, etc. And I think those were the ones that hit both Marisa and Jane Gilmore, who gave me a job writing for a magazine that she was starting up. And I wrote some funny columns for them too in around about 2009, 2010. And I think it was those two things that grabbed Marisa and kind of got me through the door.
And I think it's really important, when you say it was lucky chance meeting, they never are. You've always done it. It's kind of like you were leading to that. You're doing all this work, all this work, all this work, and then at a party, it all exploded. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, Zack Powell, you said you had to do a lot of research and a lot of learning. What was the toughest thing for you going from, say, cricket and mental health to writing as Zack Powell?
It was understanding two things. One, the audience, like who is the audience for this and what do they want? It's no longer writing, what do I think an employer wants or what do I think I want? But what does the reluctant 9-year-old reader who's picking up this book and thinks, oh, I don't like reading, what will they want? And being able to do that within the really brilliantly thought out formula that they had for the books was a real eye-opener, because it's easy when you're starting out to think of creative writing as simply an act of creative inspiration. What's harder to do is to be technical about it, to learn the technical aspects of writing. So pacing, tone, voice, matching other people's style that you don't necessarily like. Finding all of those sort of technical aspects to it to get the job done. And when I thought, at first I thought, this may be revealing too much, but at first I thought, I don't like this job. This is a bit soulless and it's going to be very technical and boring. And I don't think I'm very inspired by it. And then by the time I finished writing the one Zack Powell book that I wrote, which is the very last one, I think, I realized that in fact, being edited, working to restrictions is really, really fruitful. And you can learn a great deal about how to, not just to write what you feel like, but to write anything. How can you learn to write to brief? How can you learn to write and insert your creativity into somebody else's world? I think that's a really hard thing to learn.
When you look at Matt, the writer, say when you were working for Crikey, to Matt now writing your third novel with the second one that we're going to talk about coming out soon, what's the biggest change you can see in yourself as a writer?
I think, that's such a good question. It certainly went early on. I had no sense that I knew what I was doing. So I was literally just panickingly trying to impress whoever I was submitting to that day with every kitchen sink adverb I could think of and every nonsense.
Not the adverb.
I must have given them so much trouble editing, just cutting out endless purple rubbish that I wrote for them. But it was a way for me to just desperately try and keep the job because I really, really wanted the job. I still really, really want the job and I still feel like I have to earn it with every manuscript I submit. But I no longer feel the panic. I don't feel as though I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I certainly don't feel like an expert at what I'm doing. I'm a long way from ever thinking that. And I kind of hope I never do. But I do feel as though I've picked up a few things along the way and from all kinds of writing. So I've written consistently for content agencies and mental health organizations during the same period that I've been writing for kids. And I think I've, if anything, picked up more from those jobs about brevity and concision, economy, and just about getting stuff out the door, meeting deadlines, and making sure that you work professionally with other people. All of those things are very, very important skills, which I didn't even know existed back in the day. I just thought, I'll just write whatever I feel like and I'm sure they'll publish it, which is an obscenely naive way to start, but most of us do at some point.
Oh, we all do. I think we all start like this when you get your first rejection letter. It's a bit, oh, come on, that was great. And then you look at the book now and go, thank goodness that was rejected.
Yeah, that feeling at the first is, how dare you? How absolutely dare you reject my thing, which I spent 45 minutes on this morning. That's terrible. And then, later on, I now submitting, I think, well, if they don't publish this book, I guess that's fine because it's their money. Understanding who's paying the money is another important part of this process as well, and reducing your expectations accordingly.
Exactly. So, Matt, you went from, to use an analogy, in the driver's seat with the learning instructor beside you, to you've got your P plates and your first
Mm.
novel. How did that feel writing Orchard Underground without that Bible for Zack Powell as your guideline?
It is terrifyingly freeing because suddenly you can do as you please. I mean, you do have to pitch and you do have to write a synopsis. You have to get those accepted. In my case, I was writing on spec, so I wasn't contracted before the entire manuscript was written. So I wrote the entire thing, not knowing if it was going to get published or not. That helps to focus your mind as paychecks don't come in. So you do have to think a lot about. I'm not just writing whenever I please here. I'm actually writing for my supper, and the supper won't arrive for 6 to 9 months. Um, so yeah, that really focuses you. In my case, I had a lot to learn about plotting and pacing and character voice, things that I hadn't had to consider on this scale before. The Orchard Underground is 62,000 words long, I think, in its final edit, but it was 72 when I first wrote it, which is obscenely long for a middle grade book. I was lucky I got away with 62. Um, but yeah, learning how to pace things, learning how in the beginning to organize your own ideas. So I would have a million ideas for, oh, what if the house that's in it should look like this? But also at the same time, I'm thinking, well, the voice in this section of the novel, someone will say this funny line, or there's this major theme that I want to put through it. How do I keep all those in my head or connect them all up to make a coherent story and world? And eventually what I learned to do, where do I have them? I have them here. I bought an enormous packet of system cards. These
Ah,
guys, it's literally system cards. And every time I had an idea, I would just write it on a system card and stick it to my wall. And then eventually I would be able to see them all in one place, synthesize them down and say, okay, those three ideas are actually the same idea. Or if I combine them, they're a better idea. So I'll pull those into a note and that goes onto a file on my computer and that becomes my notes. The notes have become a chapter plan and the chapter plan becomes the story, at least in the first draft. So learning systems like that, and I'm always hopelessly inefficient at them. Sticking cards up on your wall is not the way they teach you how to do this, but I've never been taught. So I've just had to make up a system. Doing things like that helped me, and learning by failing, learning by getting a chapter terribly wrong, going in the wrong direction with the story, having a main character who sucked. The first draft had a terrible character leading it, but the secondary character was interesting, so I pushed him to the front and got rid of the main
so
character
was
altogether.
Bree the secondary character initially?
Yes, so the two main characters in the Orchard Underground are Pre Coley, who is the kid who has lived in this town for the longest, more than anybody else, because the town's only 10 years old. And Attica Stone is our protagonist. She arrives in from the big city and explodes everything to set the story going. And Pre was originally a secondary character. There was a character called Luke, Luke Barkley, and he was the most boring character in the entire world. He was just a boy who just sat there and he functioned as a kid who did all the things. But he wasn't interesting and didn't have any point to him. And I've done this several times now, is one of the things I do to start off, and this is actually a technique that I use a lot now, when I'm getting my voice together and trying to work out who my characters are, I'll put them all into a fictional situation that isn't part of the book and write 3 pages. So, okay, they're all in a room and then this unusual thing happens. How do they all react? I write 2 pages of dialogue and reaction, and it just helps me to get a sense of their voices and their basic character traits. And I did that, and that was when I discovered that Luke was the most tedious human in the world, but Pre and Attica were fantastic. And I invented another character. I thought I need some sort of weird person to throw funny lines into the story because everybody else is being functional and working things out. So I need a time bomb. I need someone throwing hand grenades to make it funny. And so I invented a character who I called Slot Car. And Slot Car is now children's favorite character in the entire story. And they keep demanding a novel of her, and I'm going to have to, clearly. But she was just a character I threw in to be fun. And it turns out she's more interesting than the ones that I planned very carefully.
Isn't it scary how that character that just pops up and you go, oh, hello, where'd you come from? That they can quite often not quite take over the novel, but they grow a life of their own. I've had it happen and it's strange.
Yeah.
You're almost, oh, get out of here.
I have this weird theory that in the same way that everyone in your dreams is you because they're in your head and you're the only one in your head. So everybody you dream about in your dreams, they're all you. So in the same way, every character in your story, people ask me, well, which one is you or which one's based on you? Well, they all are. They're all different aspects of me. And I find that doing that technical exercise liberates some of my subconscious clearly. So the conscious character who I've worked so hard on from the intellectual thinking part of my head is really not anything very interesting. What's actually interesting is finding out who bubbles up when I'm not concentrating, who comes up with a line that suddenly defines the entire book that I didn't know they were going to write, but suddenly feels so important that I have to rephrase the entire book around it. And that was Slot Car in this case.
Slot Car, love the name. So with Orchard Underground, what came first? Did the characters, and I know poor old Luke got the flick, but did the characters come first, or did you have an idea of what was going to happen?
It was a little bit of both, in the same way that in the kind of note card way, I had names of characters who I thought would be interesting, and I wonder who that character is, and I would just sort of dream about them and let them percolate in my head. I was a stay-at-home parent at the time when I was first thinking of it, and nothing focuses your mind away from professional work like having a 3-year-old to look after. So my subconscious was able to roar away at that. At the same time, I had this idea about a sort of world behind the worlds, which other people have done in different ways. And it was going to be supernatural at first. I thought, well, it will be some kind of Stranger Things style. This is before Stranger Things, but a kind of alternate dimension version of this town where everything's magical. And what it crystallized into is this sense of an adult world above where everything is boring and stable and financial and mature, that is dominated by adults and their thoughts. And then a magical world underneath, which is the children's world, the Willy Wonka's chocolate factory world, where everything can still be as magical as you believe it was when you believed in Santa and the Easter Bunny. And everything is still perfect and hasn't been broken. And as these children are kind of reaching 12 and going into high school, there's this sense of the expectation that they'll start entering the world above. And, the dreams will go, that everything will get a little bit more adult and staid and responsible, and the magic disappears. So what if you refuse to? And so, no spoilers, but there is a character in this book who just refused to grow up. And it's sort of in the background about the consequences of that decision. What if you didn't want to grow up? What if the world was swallowing you up and you were forced to become an adult, but you refused to go? What would be the consequences of that? Is that a healthy choice to always stay childlike? A lot of people say, "Oh, I never want to grow up. Don't grow up, it's a trap," whatever that quote is. But is that a good idea? At the same time, you don't want to lose all your magic and your belief and your Santa excitement. So what happens when the two things compete with each other and it seems as though there's no choice but to have one or the other, and the other has to be destroyed? You have to lose your childhood.
Matt, you were talking a lot about, deciding characters had to go and changing things. Some people seem to think, or some people believe, that writing is a solo process. I don't believe it is. I think, we need other people to help us write.
Mm.
How important were other people in helping you shape the Orchard Underground, and also just you as a writer?
Vastly important. So I talked earlier on about having that panicky sense of not really knowing what you're doing. And one of the key ways to get out of that phase of your writing career is to ask people and tell them, say, "I don't think I know what I'm doing. You seem to know things as well. Or you're panicking with me. Let's do it together and feel a bit better about it." So early on, I had a lot of help from people who weren't writers. And then as I started to know some writers, I asked their help too. I asked Penny Russon's help specifically about plotting because I didn't know how to plot a book at all. And because my main character, Pre, is a passive character. So my point of view character, the first person character, doesn't drive the story forward. And so you can't really use the hero's journey model or some of those other templates that you have to write a story. So how on earth do I write a story with a passive main character? And so she was really helpful with that kind of advice. And then once it was written, I learned, I was terrified by the idea of being edited because I'd never been part of a writer's group. I'd always been too shy to show my work to anybody. And so when I submitted, I thought, oh, well, that's it. This first draft is so awful. I can't believe I actually handed it in. I gave it a shot. I guess this is it. And they got back to me. So this is Marisa Pintado doing the structural edit at the time, and Luna Sue was doing structural and copy stuff as well, who are both geniuses. And they got in touch with me saying, "We love this story. We believe in it. This bit is awful and doesn't work." They would never have said either of those things, by the way, but that was the gist of what they were telling me. And I learned really quickly after going through my 3-day sulk of going, "How very dare you," that they were right. And my only way to get through that originally was to claim it was my idea in the first place. You go, oh, yeah. I would have done that eventually, definitely. I would have come to the same conclusion, I'm sure. Now, of course, I know that I'm foolish, and I need, the phrase I often use is that I'm the greatest expert in the world at my story, but Luna and Marisa are the greatest experts in the world at stories. So they will help me find my story far better than if I'd tried to do it on my own. And so I love being edited. I've learned that I absolutely adore being edited. I wish, one of the things I really don't like about writing is that there's only one name on the cover and there's no credits. So movies have credits, albums have liner notes, TV shows have credits. All other artistic pursuits are almost, I think, legally required to credit the people who worked on it, but not books. And so I try and use my acknowledgements page to actually tell you who else worked on this story, who designed the cover. Orchard was designed by Pooja Desai, who illustrated the cover, Marco Guadalupe. There are all of these great people who are involved with the story and enrich it at every possible level, but they never get any credit. And there's a reason for that. You know, the model of writing that is encouraged by publishing companies and writers is of its the individual creation of one person, and that helps to, you know, like a Steven Spielberg movie is still thought of as a Steven Spielberg movie, but we also know there were electricians and riggers and costume people and so on, and he didn't do all of that. So it's the same thing. It's a huge collaborative exercise, and I wish we acknowledged it more.
Exactly.
Because my book would just never have been suitable for the page if it wasn't for the help that I got from everybody before and after the manuscript was written.
And I'm very keen to say to new writers too, editing is the best thing you do. Some, like you, were really scared of editing. And I think I was when I first started too, but I love it. It's where it comes alive. That's where you find your magic. Now, speaking of magic, the new one comes out next year. Tell us about that.
Well, the next one is has the same protagonist, so it's set in the same universe. It features Attica Stone, who was the kind of amazing kick-ass girl protagonist of Orchard, and it's the story. Essentially, it's a prequel, but it stands on its own. So I'm writing all of the books in this series that I get to write as if you pick them up first. So if you read them in order, chronologically or otherwise, you can get a little bit of extra stuff out of it. But basically, it's for anyone who picks it up can still read it. It's called The Chameleon Thief. And it's the story, the tagline I use is, how far would you go to save your worst enemy? So it's the story of a friendship breakup where friends become terrible sworn enemies. And then they discover their enemy is in terrible danger, that something awful is going to happen to them and they could prevent it if they wanted to. But
What
it costs
a
to themselves.
fantastic idea, particularly for that age group that, you know, 6 going into year 7. There's always those friend bust-ups and they're always ugly. It's a great
And
idea.
they're really intense. So one of the things that people often say about kids at this age, of upper primary school kids, is, oh, you know, they have their moments, but then they're fine again seconds later, and they're just friends with whoever's in front of their house right now. That's maybe true of even younger kids, but certainly at this age, you have friendship bonds, and when they break, I remember this from being a kid, they hurt. And you can hurt other people really badly because your social skills haven't quite got to the level they needed to be at yet. And so, yeah, I wanted to write about, the other thing that I see a lot is people willing to burn other people quite quickly in the world, generally speaking. Kids, adults, whatever. We're very quick to say, well, that person's either a friend or an enemy. And if my enemy, I can say whatever I like about them because the rules of propriety don't apply to me anymore. Or that person is my friend and can therefore do no wrong and I will defend them to the grave. There are people about which I would say both of those things personally. You know, no one's going to defend Hitler if he's going down, and no one's going to say my absolute best friend in the world. If anyone talks smack about them, I'll come at them. But there is also the middle ground where your friends can do wrong. And how do you forgive people? How do you account for attrition and atonement? Yeah, what do you do with somebody who is your enemy, but you could also help? Is it only good people who deserve saving?
Oh, that's a
It's a
good
big
question.
ethical question. I don't honestly know the answer to it. The same way that there was a big decision at the end of Orchard where Pre had to decide a very important thing about those two worlds that I was talking about, and there was no going back. I didn't know what decision he was going to make when I wrote that chapter. So I literally wrote him up to a point where he has his hand on a lever that changes his universe forever, and I didn't know what he was going to do. I had to write my way through that one. In the same way, I don't know exactly how this is going to pan out. I know where it ends up with Attica because it's set before the Orchard Underground, so I know where she ends up. But I don't know exactly how she's going to get there or who gets saved along the way, if anyone.
Do you find that
Um,
exciting or terrifying, that not quite knowing? I like to know the end. It doesn't mean I'm going to get to the end, but I like to know where I'm going. So for you, are you okay with that? We could end up anywhere.
it's a thrilling tension that I like to keep going as long as possible because it means I'm going to write the story not signaling to you an obvious solution, even subliminally. Like I'm not setting you up for an obvious solution. I might, and I do this deliberately in both of the books that I've written, I will throw you bones to say, you could definitely try this if you wanted to. She could definitely do this. But is she going to? Like what decision will Attica eventually make? What decision will Pre eventually make? I like to put kids in those sophisticated moral dilemma situations because I think they're better at them than people suspect. Also, they're complicated human beings just like adults, and so they might make what you think is the wrong decision. They might make what I think is the wrong decision. I'm okay with that because I don't think we need to always show kids making perfect choices all the
Mm.
time. There's another cliche is that children are wiser than adults thing. They're not. They're just like us. They're just trying to bumbling through and trying their best.
Exactly. You have a year seven son.
Mm.
How does he and his reading, I guess, influence what you write?
Enormously. So especially on Orchard, where he was probably 7 or 8 when I was writing the first draft of Orchard, and he sat on my lap every day, and I would read him what I'd written. And essentially, if he laughed, it stayed. But if he fidgeted and got bored, I knew I was in trouble. And there were some things where 3 days later he would quote me a line that I'd written and laugh about it, and I'd forgotten I'd even written it, but I realized that it was catching him somehow, so it must be okay. And so there's a particular character called Glue who's in Orchard Underground, who's like the bully's assistant. You know, that kind of snivelly second kid who reaches around beside the bully and, that's behind all the time but is threatening. That kid, he has this habit of making terrible jokes and saying, people say to him, good comeback, Glue, or good one. And that stuck with Sam and so it stuck with me, and I kept it all the way through. And it gave this sniveling bully kid a little journey that he took, which changed him at the end and made him a more interesting character than he would have been otherwise. So yeah, my son has a very, very good ear for stories, and is uniquely placed to tell me when my story's not good, because he doesn't owe me anything except his life, the little monster, and will definitely tell me if I'm not good enough.
Mine, well, she's 26 now, but at the time she was in grade 5, and I think I'd written 2 books by then, and I'd given her
Mm.
the third one and said, have a look at this, hun. Anyway, she came out of a room after reading it, dumped it in front of me and said, I think you're getting better. I went, oh, thank you.
That is sensational, and only your child can say that to
Oh,
you.
it was brilliant, and it really was that, well, I think you're getting better. Good on
Yeah,
me.
if you continue with this, you can make a living.
Yeah, wow. Matt, just a last point before we go. What advice would you give to would-be writers, whether they're a young person your son's age who loves writing, or whether
Mm.
they're an older person who wants to make a career of it? What's your major tip?
I think for a kid my son's age, and I talk to kids this age a lot, my suggestion and encouragement is always just don't think about a career in writing, just write. If you like stories, write stories, tell stories. Don't think that you have to write books. You can write anything you please. Write a zine, write a blog post, write a limerick. It doesn't matter. Just keep telling stories because it's the part of them from the Orchard Underground, this part of the world. That's the bit that has to integrate and not get lost as you go up into that adult world. So if you can keep that going, and it might be through music, it could be through dance or sport or anything, but if you have a storytelling gene in you, keep fostering it no matter what. And don't think about how you'll make a career out of it or who else you'll impress with it. Do it entirely for yourself and whatever friends are interested in it. Just right. Don't give up that part of you no matter what. It's just as important as your homework and anything else. Keep playing because that's essentially what it is. It's a form of play. For adults, it's a slightly different message, which is don't give up. It's really, really hard. And yes, I got a lucky break, but also I could have squandered that break any number of times during the process. And I had to give up twice because I was broke. And I'm still not making a great deal of money. And I never ever will. And I'm pretty much used to that idea by now. But I'm going to do it because it's the only thing I really want to do. That writing stories. And now I think, having settled into this mode, writing stories for children is something that makes me so intensely happy that I'm willing to sit for days when it's very, very hard and when I don't like my story anymore because I've rewritten it 5 times and I've taken on so many different editorial suggestions that I can't remember what draft I'm on or what story the story is anymore. And I hate it. And I absolutely, genuinely despise my job. I still do it because I want that book on the shelf. When I was 8 years old, I saw a book on a shelf in a bookshop in Collins Bookstore in Eastland in Ringwood in Melbourne. And I said, I want one of those. And it snapped into action 35 years later. And I got my first one on the shelf and I want another one now. I want to keep doing it. I'm hooked.
Do you remember what that book was that made you go, I want to write?
Do you know, I think it was probably an Anne McCaffrey book because I can remember standing in the science fiction and fantasy section, which was the only section I was interested in going into. The kids book bit at the back I didn't like. And it was either like a Douglas Adams book or an Anne McCaffrey book or a Judy Blume book, maybe, if I was down the kids section or something along those lines. But I think I might not have even read the book. It was just the idea that, oh, I see the name on the side, that person wrote this book and now they're just a person. So if they wrote a book and it's on the shelf and people can buy it and have the experience that I have when I read books, I could do that. Like I could write stories and put them be on a shelf and people would read them and say, I want that. And so that's the kind of ambition that I had, which then drifted and then came back to me later in life. But it never really went away.
I don't think you can call it drifting. I think this is my theory. This is my excuse. Anyway, we need to live before we can write. So you went away and lived and then wrote. That's what you were doing. You were gathering up ideas for stories.
I was lying fallow. And true. I mean, in a very real sense, when I started writing The Orchard Underground, it was 2009. And I gave up on it for 6 years because I didn't know how to write it yet. I hadn't read enough children's literature. I hadn't written enough. I hadn't worked hard enough yet to know how to write it. I was ruining it. I was going to ruin a perfectly good book. And so I actually put it down and waited and did other work for 6 years, I think, before I came back to it. You've got to lie fallow sometimes.
Exactly. Congratulations on The Orchard Underground and also the newie, which comes out in 2021 next year.
2021. Everything's a bit up in the air at the moment, but the dates have all been pushed back. I think it'll be about mid to third quarter 2021, something along those lines.
Beautiful. And that's called The Chameleon Thief, and that follows one of the characters from The Orchard Underground.
It does. Attica Stone from The Orchard Underground is back.
Beautiful. It has been so lovely to meet you, and thank you for taking the time to chat. It's been great. Thanks, Matt.
It's been an absolute delight, Sue. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Pleasure.